The rusted windmill that had creaked in the Texas wind for over a century now lay in pieces across the dusty earth of the Thornhill Ranch, its once proud blades scattered like broken bones. Mark Thornhill wiped sweat from his brow as he surveyed the demolition site, wondering if tearing down this landmark, the last standing structure from his great-grandfather's original homestead, was just another in a long line of desperate decisions that would only delay the inevitable loss of his family's heritage. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The August heat pressed down on the land like a physical weight, shimmering above the parched earth where cattle once grazed on lush pastures. Now those same fields were cracked and barren, victims of 3 consecutive years of drought that had transformed the once prosperous 2,800-acre Thornhill Ranch into a financial death spiral. Mark's weathered F-150 sat nearby, its bed loaded with the salvageable metal from the windmill. That might bring a few $100s at the scrapyard in Austin, money that wouldn't even cover next month's interest on his mounting debt. At 42, Mark had the calloused hands and sun-weathered face of a man who'd spent his life working outdoors. The 5th-generation rancher had inherited not just the land but the responsibility of preserving a family legacy that stretched back to 1868, when Confederate veteran Samuel Thornhill had claimed this patch of Texas hill country and transformed it into one of the region's most respected cattle operations. For more than 150 years, Thornhills had weathered every challenge the land and economy could throw at them until now. "You sure about this?" called out Hector Ramirez, Mark's foreman and closest friend since childhood. He stood by the backhoe they'd rented to dig out the windmill's concrete foundation, another expense they could ill afford. "Your grandfather always said this windmill was the heart of the ranch." Mark nodded grimly, unable to articulate the mix of shame and desperation that had driven him to this decision. The truth was brutally simple. The Thornhill Ranch had exactly 73 days before First National Bank of Austin would begin foreclosure proceedings. The drought had decimated his herd, forcing Mark to sell off cattle at rock-bottom prices, just to generate enough cash to keep operations going. The market collapse couldn't have come at a worse time, with beef prices plummeting just as his costs for feed, fuel, and medicine skyrocketed. "No choice, Hector," Mark finally answered, his voice rough with emotion. "That old foundation's solid concrete. Salvage companies offering $1,200 for the rebar, alone if we can extract it clean. That's almost enough for next week's feed delivery." What Mark didn't say was that his wife Emily's medical bills had been the final blow to their precarious finances. Her diagnosis with lupus 2 years ago had required specialized treatment that their rural insurance barely covered. Even with her teaching salary from the local high school, they'd fallen further behind with each emergency room visit and specialist consultation. The decision to demolish the historic windmill hadn't come easily. Built in 1897, it had been the ranch's primary water source until modern wells were drilled in the 1950s. Mark's grandfather, Jacob Thornhill, had maintained it meticulously, insisting it represented the family's resilience and self-sufficiency. Even after it stopped pumping water, it had stood as an iconic landmark, visible for miles across the rolling hills. Local photographers had featured it in countless Texas calendars and coffee table books. "Let's get this done," Mark said, climbing into the backhoe's cab. The rental clock was ticking, and every hour cost money they didn't have. The foundation needed to be broken apart today, with the concrete separated from the valuable steel reinforcement bars that could be sold for scrap. It was precise, difficult work, the kind that normally would require specialized equipment and trained operators. But the Thornhill Ranch couldn't afford such luxuries anymore. Hector nodded and moved back as Mark started the engine. The backhoe's hydraulics whined as he positioned the bucket above the exposed foundation where the windmill's tower had stood. The massive concrete base had been poured by his great-grandfather and had withstood more than a century of Texas weather. Breaking it apart would require precision to avoid damaging the valuable rebar inside. The bucket's teeth bit into the weathered concrete with a sound like grinding bones. Mark winced as decades of family history crumbled under the mechanical assault. His grandfather would have been heartbroken to see this day, but sentimentality wasn't going to save the ranch. Only cash would do that, and there wasn't nearly enough of it flowing through the Thornhill accounts. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the backhoe tore into the foundation, the bucket suddenly caught on something solid, sending a shudder through the Kazia machine. Mark cut the engine immediately, concerned he'd hit a water line or some other infrastructure that wasn't on the property maps. The last thing they needed was an additional repair bill. "What happened?" Hector called, approaching cautiously. Mark climbed down from the cab, frowning. "Hit something solid. Doesn't feel like rebar or a pipe." He grabbed a shovel from his truck and began clearing away the loose concrete debris, working carefully around the spot where the backhoe had stalled. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly as they worked, turning the excavation into a test of endurance. After 20 minutes of digging, Mark's shovel struck something with a dull clang that didn't sound like concrete or modern metal. He dropped to his knees, using his hands to brush away the remaining debris, revealing what appeared to be a metal plate or door embedded in the deeper portion of the foundation. "What the hell?" he muttered, clearing more material away. The metal was unlike anything he'd expected to find, not modern steel or aluminum, but something that appeared much older, with a greenish patina suggesting aged brass or copper. As more of it became visible, Mark could see it wasn't just a random piece of metal, but something deliberately installed, a square access panel approximately 2 feet across with what appeared to be a simple locking mechanism in its center. Hector crouched beside him, his expression shifting from curiosity to cautious excitement. "That doesn't look like any part of a normal windmill foundation I've ever seen." Mark nodded slowly, his mind racing. The Thornhill Ranch had been in his family since shortly after the Civil War, and the stories of those early years were part of their family lore. His great-great-grandfather Samuel had been a cavalry officer in the Confederate Army, returning to Texas after the war with little more than the clothes on his back and the horse he rode. Yet somehow, he'd acquired enough capital to purchase this land and establish a ranch that had grown into one of the most successful operations in the county. The family history had always been vague about the source of Samuel's initial funding. Some versions claimed he'd worked as a marshal for several years, saving every penny. Others suggested he'd struck a minor gold vein while traveling through the hill country. But Mark's grandfather had occasionally hinted at deeper secrets, speaking in careful terms about resources that helped the South rebuild, and contributions that couldn't be acknowledged publicly. As a child, Mark had dismissed these comments as the romantic exaggerations of an old man with a fondness for family mythology. But now, staring at this hidden metal panel embedded in a foundation that dated back to the 1890s, those cryptic references took on new significance. "Should we open it?" Hector asked, breaking the silence. Mark hesitated. If this was some kind of access panel to an old water system or abandoned well shaft, opening it carelessly could create new problems they couldn't afford to fix. But his instincts told him this was something altogether different, something deliberately concealed within a structure that had stood unquestioned for over a century. "Get me the toolbox from the truck," he said finally, "and the flashlight." While Hector retrieved the tools, Mark examined the locking mechanism more closely. It wasn't a modern lock, but something that appeared handcrafted, a simple turnbolt design that had probably been state-of-the-art in the late 19th century. Decades of corrosion had seized it in place, but it remained intact, suggesting that whatever lay beneath had remained undisturbed since the foundation was poured. With Hector's help, Mark applied penetrating oil to the mechanism and waited for it to work through the corrosion. The minutes stretched into an hour as they worked the bolt, applying gentle pressure and more lubricant until, with a sound like distant thunder, the ancient lock finally surrendered. "Here goes nothing," Mark said, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. He gripped the edges of the metal panel and lifted, expecting resistance. Instead, the panel rose smoothly, balanced on hidden hinges that had somehow survived decades encased in concrete. The engineering precision spoke of careful planning and significant resources. This was no improvised hiding place, but something designed for permanence. As the panel opened fully, both men stared in stunned silence at what lay revealed in the hollow space beneath. Instead of a shaft or technical access point, they found themselves looking at a carefully constructed chamber, roughly 4 feet square and 3 feet deep. The space was lined with what appeared to be copper sheeting, creating a waterproof vault that had protected its contents from moisture and the elements for over a century. And those contents made Mark's breath catch in his throat. Neatly stacked inside the chamber were wooden crates, their surfaces darkened with age but still intact. Each bore stenciled markings partially visible in the sunlight. "C as a treasury," and what appeared to be inventory numbers. Between and around the crates were canvas bags with drawstrings, their fabric remarkably preserved by the dry environment of the sealed chamber. Mark reached down with trembling hands and lifted one of the smaller bags. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, the contents shifting with a distinctive sound that every human recognizes instinctively, the muffled chime of metal coins moving against each other. He loosened the drawstring and tipped the bag, allowing a few of its contents to spill into his palm. Gold gleamed in the harsh Texas sunlight coins that Mark immediately recognized as American $20 gold pieces from the mid-19th century. But these weren't just any historical coins. Each bore the distinct markings of Confederate restrikes gold coins, minted by the Confederate States of America during the desperate final years of the Civil War, when the South was attempting to establish legitimacy for its currency on international markets. "Mother of God," Hector whispered, his voice filled with awe. "Is that what I think it is?" Mark could only nod, his mind struggling to process the implications. Confederate gold was the stuff of legends and treasure hunter fantasies. Most historians believe the majority of the Confederacy's precious metal reserves had been captured by Union forces or dispersed among fleeing officials in the chaotic final days of the war. Occasional small caches had been discovered over the decades, but nothing of this magnitude had been reported in over a century. He carefully returned the coins to the bag and set it aside, then reached for one of the wooden crates. The lid was secured with simple iron nails that had fused with the wood over time. Using a pry bar from his toolbox, Mark worked carefully around the edges until the nails surrendered their grip and the lid lifted free. Inside, nestled in straw packing material that had turned to dust, lay rows of gold bars, each approximately the size of a deck of cards and stamped with the seal of the Confederate Treasury. Mark lifted one with reverence, feeling its substantial weight, probably around 10 ounces. He guessed, worth more than $20,000 at current gold prices. And there were dozens more visible in this crate alone, with 5 additional crates still unopened in the chamber. This has to be worth millions," Hector said, his voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might cause the treasure to vanish like a desert mirage. Mark set the gold bar back in its crate with the care one might show a newborn child. His mind was racing, trying to connect this discovery with what he knew of his family's history. His great-great-grandfather Samuel had been a cavalry officer, stationed in Richmond during the final months of the war. Family lore had always emphasized his role in protecting supply lines. But what if that protection had included escorting portions of the Confederate treasury west as the Union forces closed in on the capital? It would explain so much how a destitute former soldier had acquired enough capital to purchase a substantial ranch in the aftermath of a devastating war. Why he had built this windmill with its secret chamber, and why the family had maintained it so religiously for generations afterward. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a financial windfall. It was a historical discovery of national significance. Confederate gold had been the subject of academic debate and treasure hunter obsession for over 150 years. Museums, universities, and private collectors would be desperate to study and acquire these artifacts. The value would far exceed the simple melt price of the gold. These were cultural artifacts from a pivotal moment in American history. But as the initial shock began to fade, more practical concerns pressed into Mark's consciousness. Who legally owned this treasure? Would the government claim it as abandoned property? Would historians demand it be donated to museums? Did his discovery make the Thornhill Ranch a protected historical site, preventing him from selling it even if he wanted to? And most immediately pressing, how could he secure this find until he determined the right course of action? The remote location of the ranch had always been both a blessing and a curse. Miles from the nearest neighbor, they had privacy and security through isolation. But that same isolation made them vulnerable if word of this discovery leaked out. "Hector," Mark said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil of his thoughts, "we need to keep this absolutely quiet until we figure out what to do. Not a word to anyone, not your family, not at the feed store, nowhere." Hector nodded solemnly. "You know I'd never betray your trust, Mark. Whatever you decide to do with this, I'm with you." Mark studied his friend's face, seeing the sincerity. There, Hector had been more than an employee for the past 20 years. He had been a brother in all but blood, standing with the Thornhill family through good times and bad. His loyalty wasn't in question, but the magnitude of this discovery would test anyone's resolve. "Help me secure this for now," Mark said. "We'll put everything back in the chamber and replace the panel. I need time to think, to research what this means legally and historically." As they carefully repacked the treasure, Mark's mind was already formulating a plan. He would need to document everything meticulously before making any announcements. He would need legal advice from someone specializing in historical artifacts and treasure law. Most importantly, he would need to understand the full historical context of how this gold had come to be hidden beneath his family's windmill. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon as they secured the metal panel back in place and covered it with loose dirt. They would need to continue the demolition work as planned to avoid raising suspicions, but Mark would ensure the foundation with its secret chamber remained intact beneath a cosmetic layer of broken concrete. As they drove back toward the ranch house in silence, the implications of their discovery continued to expand in Mark's mind. This wasn't just about financial salvation for the Thornhill Ranch, though that aspect couldn't be ignored. This was about his family's legacy, about historical truth, and about honoring the past while securing the future. For generations, the Thornhills had been caretakers of a secret they didn't even know they possessed. Now that knowledge had passed to Mark, along with the responsibility of deciding what should be done with a treasure that belonged not just to his family, but to history itself. The windmill had always been the heart of the ranch, his grandfather had insisted. Now Mark understood why it hadn't just provided water for cattle and crops. It had stood guard over a legacy that connected his family to one of the most tumultuous periods in American history. And somehow Mark knew, understanding that connection would be crucial to determining the right path forward, not just for his family, but for the proper stewardship of a historical treasure that had waited more than 150 years to be rediscovered. As the ranch house came into view, Mark made a silent promise to his ancestors. He would not squander this opportunity, nor would he use it merely for personal gain. Whatever decisions he made would honor the trust that had been placed in the Thornhill family when this treasure was first concealed beneath the Texas soil. The windmill might be dismantled, But its purpose to protect and preserve would continue through his actions in the days ahead. Mark couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw gold gleaming in the Texas sunlight, felt its weight in his hands, and wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. By dawn, he was sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop, Emily's worried gaze following him as she prepared coffee. "You were tossing and turning all night," she said, setting a steaming mug in front of him. At 38, Emily Thornhill still possessed the quiet beauty that had captivated him when they were high school sweethearts, though 2 decades of ranch life and recent health struggles had etched fine lines around her eyes. "Is it the bank? Did they call again?" Mark shook his head, struggling with whether to share the discovery. Emily was his partner in everything. They'd faced every challenge together since their wedding day. But this secret felt dangerous, as if merely speaking it aloud might somehow expose them to risks he couldn't yet identify. "Just thinking about the Windmill demolition," he said finally, the half-truth bitter on his tongue. "Found some unusual construction in the foundation. Need to research it before we continue." Emily studied his face with the perception that 20 years of marriage had honed. "That's not everything, is it?" Before Mark could answer, their 17-year-old daughter Abigail rushed into the kitchen, already dressed for her summer job. At the local veterinary clinic, she grabbed a piece of toast and kissed her mother's cheek. "Dad, Dr. Wilkins says he can look at that sick heifer this afternoon if you can bring her in. He'll only charge for the medicine, not the visit." She delivered this small victory with the pride of someone who'd negotiated a significant concession, which in their current financial situation, it was. Mark nodded, grateful for his daughter's initiative, but painfully aware that such small economies wouldn't ultimately save the ranch. Not without the gold, and not without determining what that gold meant for their future. After Abigail left and Emily retreated to prepare for her summer school teaching session, Mark began his research. In earnest. The internet yielded a wealth of information about Confederate gold, much of it speculative, contradictory, or clearly fanciful. But certain historical facts were well established. The Confederate treasury had contained substantial gold reserves. Toward the end of the war, much of which had disappeared during the fall of Richmond in April 1865, historians and treasure hunters had tracked portions of this gold over the decades. Some had been captured by Union forces, some had made its way to England to pay Confederate debts, and small caches had occasionally surfaced throughout the South. But a significant amount estimated at several $million in 1865 currency had never been accounted for. Mark's search led him to academic papers describing the lost cause caches, gold hidden by Confederate sympathizers after the war, intended to fund a potential resurgence that never materialized. These caches were distinct from the official Treasury gold, being private wealth contributed to the Confederate cause by wealthy Southern families. As the morning progressed, Mark found himself focusing on one particular historical detail. Texas Brigade, an elite Confederate unit that had served in Virginia throughout the war. His great-great-grandfather had been an officer in this brigade, and family lore had always emphasized his close relationship with General John Bell Hood, the unit's most famous commander. What if Samuel Thornhill's role in the final days of the Confederacy had been more significant than family history acknowledged? What if he had been entrusted with a portion of the Confederate gold, with instructions to secure it in the West where Union control was weaker? Mark's research was interrupted by the arrival of Hector, who entered the kitchen with the cautious demeanor of a man carrying explosive information. "Mark, we have a problem," he said quietly, glancing toward the doorway to ensure they were alone. "Santiago was asking questions this morning about why we stopped the Windmill demolition." Santiago Lopez was one of their seasonal workers, reliable and hardworking, but not part of the inner circle that had kept the Thornhill Ranch operating through its recent difficulties. "What did you tell him?" Mark asked, closing his laptop. Said we hit some old pipes we need to map before continuing. But he mentioned seeing us pull something out of the ground. I don't think he saw what it was, but he knows we found something. Mark processed this unwelcome development. Even a hint of treasure could spread through the county like wildfire, bringing amateur treasure hunters, media attention, and potentially government officials before he had time to understand his legal position. Keep him busy on the north pasture. Fence line today, Mark said. I need to make some calls. After Hector left, Mark faced the most immediate question: who could provide trustworthy expert advice about a discovery of this magnitude? He needed someone with knowledge of historical artifacts, treasure law, and the discretion to handle sensitive information. After considering his limited options, he settled on Dr. Elizabeth Chun, a history professor at the University of Texas who had once visited the ranch while researching a book on frontier Texas. The call to Dr. Chun was carefully worded. Mark described finding historical artifacts during the Windmill demolition that might have Confederate significance. He avoided specifics but emphasized the need for confidential consultation, offering to pay for her time and expertise. To his relief, Dr. Chun remembered the Thornhill Ranch and agreed to drive out the following day, suggesting they meet privately before involving any other authorities. Her caution matched Mark's own instincts. Historical discoveries of this nature could become complicated quickly, with multiple parties asserting claims. The remainder of the day passed in a fog of anticipation and anxiety. Mark went through the motions of ranch work, checking cattle in the north pasture and repairing equipment in the barn, but his mind remained fixed on the hidden chamber and its implications for his family's future. That evening, after a quiet dinner during which Emily cast increasingly concerned glances his way, Mark finally made the decision to confide in his wife. They sat on the porch swing as twilight settled over the ranch, the distant hills turning purple against the fading light. "There's something I need to show you," he said, taking her hand. "Something that might change everything for us." Emily listened without interruption as Mark described the hidden chamber and its contents. When he finished, she remained silent for several long moments, processing the magnitude of what he'd told her. "So all this time," she said finally, "well, we've been fighting to save the ranch, worrying about medical bills and bank loans. There was a fortune buried under that old windmill?" Mark nodded. "Apparently my great-great-grandfather had secrets that died with him. The question now is, what we do with those secrets?" Emily's practical nature asserted itself immediately. "What are the legal implications? Does finding treasure on your own property make it yours? That's why Dr. Chun is coming tomorrow. The laws around treasure troves are complicated, especially when they might have historical significance. And this isn't just any historical gold, it's Confederate gold, which carries all kinds of additional complications." Emily squeezed his hand. "Whatever happens, we face it together." "But Mark," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully, "be prepared for this to become bigger than just us. Something like this doesn't stay secret for long." Her words proved prophetic sooner than either could have anticipated. The following morning, Mark looked up from his coffee to see a dust cloud approaching along the ranch road, not the single vehicle he expected from Dr. Chun, but 3 vehicles moving with purpose toward the house. The lead vehicle was a county sheriff's cruiser, followed by an unmarked sedan and a pickup truck with the logo of the Lone Star Historical Society emblazoned on its door. Mark felt his stomach tighten as they pulled into the yard. Sheriff Ray Caldwell emerged from the cruiser with the weary expression of a man performing an unwelcome duty. Behind him, a tall woman in her 50s exited the sedan, while 2 men in casual business attire stepped from the Historical Society truck. "Morning, Mark," the sheriff said, removing his hat as he approached the porch. "Got a situation we need to discuss." Mark nodded to Emily, who retreated inside, understanding the need to prepare for whatever was coming. He stepped down to meet the visitors, maintaining a neutral expression despite the alarm bells ringing in his mind. What can I help you with? Ray? The sheriff gestured to the woman beside him. This is Agent Diane Foster with the FBI Art Crimes Division. These gentlemen are from the Historical Society. They'd like to ask you some questions about an archaeological find on your property. Agent Foster stepped forward, offering her credentials for inspection. Mr. Thornhill, we've received information that you may have uncovered artifacts of historical significance during your windmill demolition. We'd like to discuss the proper procedures for documenting and preserving such finds. Mark kept his expression neutral, though his mind was racing. How had they learned about the discovery so quickly? The only people who knew were Emily Hector and possibly Santiago, if he'd seen more than he let on. I'm not sure what you're referring to, Mark said carefully. We're dismantling an old windmill structure, yes, but we haven't completed the excavation of the foundation yet. Agent Foster's smile didn't reach her eyes. Mr. Thornhill, we have reason to believe you've uncovered a cache of Civil War-era artifacts, possibly including currency or precious metals. Federal law requires such discoveries to be properly documented, particularly when they may constitute protected historical resources. Before Mark could respond, Dr. Elizabeth Chun's SUV pulled into the yard. She emerged looking confused at the gathering of official vehicles, but approached with professional composure. Dr. Chun, Mark called out, relieved to see a potential ally. Thank you for coming. It seems we have several parties interested in the historical aspects of the ranch today. Recognition flashed across Agent Foster's face. Dr. Chun, I wasn't aware you were consulting on this matter. I received a call from Mr. Thornhill yesterday about potential historical artifacts, Dr. Chun replied carefully. I agreed to provide an initial assessment before any formal processes were initiated. The tension in the yard was palpable as the various parties sized each other up. Mark realized he was witnessing the first skirmish in what could become a complex battle over the treasure, a battle he wasn't prepared to fight without understanding the legal landscape. Perhaps we should all sit down, he suggested, gesturing toward the porch. I'm happy to cooperate with proper authorities, but I'd like to understand exactly what's being alleged and what my rights are as the property owner. The next 2 hours unfolded in a tense discussion around the porch table. Agent Foster explained that an anonymous tip had alerted authorities to a potential discovery of Confederate artifacts on the Thornhill property. Under various federal and state laws, such discoveries needed to be reported and properly documented, particularly when they might constitute cultural heritage items. Dr. Chun, proving her worth immediately, outlined the complex legal framework surrounding such finds from the Archaeological Resources Protection Act to Texas state laws on treasure troves and abandoned property. The Historical Society representatives emphasized the scholarly importance of preserving any Civil War artifacts in their historical context. Throughout the discussion, Mark carefully avoided confirming or denying the specific nature of what they had found. He acknowledged uncovering unusual structural elements during the windmill demolition, but insisted that proper evaluation by experts like Dr. Chun was his next intended step. I understand everyone's concerns, Mark said finally, but this is private property that's been in my family for over 150 years. Whatever historical significance this ranch might have, I need to understand my rights before proceeding further. Agent Foster's expression hardened slightly. Mr. Thornhill, I should make it clear that concealing or attempting to sell historically significant artifacts, particularly those that might constitute federal property, could have serious legal consequences. Are you suggesting that anything found on my ranch automatically belongs to the government? Mark asked, feeling his temper rise despite his efforts to remain diplomatic. Dr. Chun intervened smoothly. I think what Agent Foster is trying to explain is that the legal status of certain historical items can be complex. Confederate government property, in particular, exists in a unique legal category because of how the Civil War ended. Sheriff Caldwell, who had remained mostly silent, finally spoke up. "Look, Mark's a respected member of this community. His family has owned this land since before any of our current laws were written. Seems to me he deserves the courtesy of proper legal consultation before we start making claims on whatever he might have found." The standoff eventually resolved into an uneasy compromise. Mark agreed to allow Dr. Chen to conduct a preliminary assessment of the site, with the understanding that she would document any findings according to proper archaeological standards. Agent Foster would return the following day with the appropriate paperwork for a formal investigation, and no excavation would proceed until all parties had clarified their positions. As the vehicles departed, leaving only Dr. Chen's SUV in the yard, Mark felt the weight of what was happening settling on his shoulders. The simple act of demolishing an old windmill had unleashed forces beyond his control: government agencies, historical societies, and likely more parties yet to come, all converging on his struggling ranch with competing claims and agendas. "That could have gone worse," Dr. Chen observed as they watched the dust cloud recede down the ranch road. "How did they find out so quickly?" Mark asked, still puzzled by the timing. Dr. Chen shrugged. "Rural communities have few secrets. But there's something else to consider. The FBI doesn't typically respond so rapidly to vague reports of historical finds unless they have specific interest in the item. I suspect they've been monitoring for reports of Confederate gold for a very long time." This observation sent a chill through Mark. Had his family been sitting on a secret that others had been actively searching for? Had his great-grandfather, Samuel, been more than just a returning Confederate soldier who built a successful ranch? "Dr. Chen, before we look at the site, I need to know, legally speaking, where do I stand? If this is truly Confederate treasury gold, who owns it?" The historian's expression grew thoughtful. "That's an extraordinarily complex question. Confederate government property technically became United States property after the war, which is likely the basis for the FBI's interest. However, property that was hidden or abandoned for over 150 years, on private land continuously owned by the same family, creates a compelling counter-argument." She continued, "There's also the matter of historical versus monetary value. These items are potentially priceless historical artifacts, which creates a public interest in their preservation. But that doesn't automatically negate your rights as the property owner and discoverer." Mark absorbed this information, feeling the weight of responsibility growing heavier. This wasn't just about saving the ranch anymore, it was about history, legacy, and doing right by both his ancestors and future generations. "What would you do in my position?" he asked finally. Dr. Chen smiled slightly. "I'm a historian, Mr. Thornhill. My instinct is always to preserve the historical record above all else, but I also believe that history belongs to the families who lived it, not just to institutions and governments." She gathered her notebook and pen. "Now, perhaps you should show me exactly what we're dealing with, so I can help you navigate what comes next." As they walked toward the windmill site, Mark felt a curious sense of relief. The secret was out, at least partially, and now the path forward would involve not just his decisions, but the complex intersection of law, history, and competing interests. Whatever happened next, the Thornhill Ranch had already reclaimed its place in history, not just as a struggling cattle operation, but as the keeper of secrets that connected his family to the tumultuous birth of modern Texas. The Windmill Foundation, partially excavated, but with its crucial secrets still hidden beneath hastily replaced dirt, awaited them. Mark realized that whatever treasure lay beneath was already transforming his understanding of his family's past and would inevitably reshape its future in ways he could barely begin to imagine. The sun hung low in the Texas sky as Mark led Dr. Chen to the Windmill Foundation. The historian's practiced eyes surveyed the excavation site with professional interest. But Mark could see the moment when academic curiosity gave way to genuine excitement as he revealed the metal panel embedded in the concrete. "This is remarkable," she murmured, crouching beside the hidden door. "The craftsmanship alone suggests this wasn't improvised. Someone designed this chamber with permanence in mind." Mark nodded, recalling his similar observation. "My great-great-grandfather wasn't just hiding something temporarily. He was creating a time capsule meant to last generations." Under Dr. Chun's guidance, they carefully reopened the chamber. Despite having seen the contents before, Mark felt a renewed sense of awe as the gold gleamed in the afternoon light. Dr. Chun's reaction was everything he might have expected from a historian encountering a legendary treasure professional. Composure battling childlike wonder. "These aren't just Confederate treasury bars," she said, examining one of the gold ingots with gloved hands. "These are from the New Orleans Mint. The markings indicate they were cast in 1861, just after Louisiana seceded." She looked up at Mark, her eyes wide. "This is unprecedented. Most Confederate gold was melted down or recirculated after the war. To find original mint bars preserved in their original state, this is beyond significant." As Dr. Chun carefully documented each item, photographing and recording detailed descriptions, Mark found himself thinking less about the gold's monetary value and more about the extraordinary circumstances that had brought it to his family's land. What kind of man had his great-great-grandfather been, to bear such responsibility through the chaos of a collapsing nation, to safeguard this wealth through the dangerous post-war years when former Confederates were viewed with suspicion? "There's something else here," Dr. Chun said suddenly, her voice dropping to a near whisper. She had shifted several crates and was examining what appeared to be a leather document case tucked against the far wall of the chamber. Unlike the gold, which had been meticulously organized in crates and bags, this case seemed to have been placed separately, perhaps as an afterthought. The leather had hardened with age but remained remarkably intact, preserved by the chamber's controlled environment. A simple brass clasp held it closed, the metal dark with tarnish but unbroken. Dr. Chun looked to Mark, silently asking permission to proceed. "Go ahead," he said, his curiosity overcoming any reservations. With careful movements, she released the clasp and opened the case. Inside lay a stack of documents, handwritten letters, official-looking papers with faded seals, and a bound journal. The topmost document bore the letterhead of the Confederate Treasury Department and was dated March 30th, 1865, just days before Richmond fell to Union forces. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Chun whispered, her academic detachment momentarily forgotten. "This appears to be an official transfer order, authorizing Captain Samuel Thornhill to transport Treasury assets westward for safekeeping." Mark leaned closer, struggling to decipher the elaborate handwriting. "Does it say why him? Why was my great-great-grandfather chosen for this?" Dr. Chun scanned the document. It references his unwavering loyalty to the cause and demonstrated discretion in matters of financial transport. "But there's something else." She carefully turned to the second page. "It mentions that he's being entrusted with these specific assets because of his familial connections in the Western Territories and established roots beyond Union surveillance." A piece of the puzzle clicked into place for Mark. Family. History had always mentioned that Samuel's sister had married a Texas rancher before the war, settling near what was now the Thornhill property. That connection would have provided a legitimate reason for his travel west and a safe haven once he arrived. The journal proved even more revealing. Written in Samuel Thornhill's neat, disciplined hand, it chronicled his journey from Richmond to Texas in the chaotic final days of the Confederacy. The early entries described the desperate evacuation of Treasury assets as Union forces closed in on the capital, with Samuel assigned to one of several teams charged with moving different portions of the Confederate gold reserves. "Listen to this," Dr. Chun said, reading aloud from an entry dated April 3, 1865. Richmond has fallen. News reached us at dawn as we crossed into Western Virginia. The President and Cabinet are fleeing south. Our orders remain unchanged. Continue. West. Avoid Union patrols. Preserve these assets for the future of our cause. The men know nothing of our cargo, believing we transport military documents only. This deception is necessary, but weighs heavily upon my conscience. The journal detailed a harrowing journey through mountains and forests, avoiding main roads, and Union checkpoints, traveling by night when necessary. Samuel had commanded a small escort of trusted soldiers, most of whom were eventually dismissed as they traveled deeper into Western territories, where Union presence was minimal. A May entry described Samuel's decision as news of the Confederate surrender spread. The cause as we knew it is lost, but the principles for which we fought remain. I am resolved that these resources shall not fall into Northern hands to be used against our people, but neither shall they fuel further bloodshed. They shall be preserved for a day when they might serve the true interests of a reconciled nation. Dr. Chun looked up from the journal. He wasn't planning to use this gold to restart the war. He was preserving it almost as if he foresaw a time when its historical significance would outweigh its value as currency. Further entries chronicled Samuel's arrival in Texas, his reunion with his sister's family, and his careful considerations about how to secure the gold for the long term. The windmill and its hidden chamber had been constructed over several months in late 1866, designed with the help of a German engineer who had immigrated to Texas before the war, and who asked no questions about the purpose of such unusual construction. The final entries revealed Samuel's ethical struggle with his role as guardian of Confederate wealth. He had clearly believed he was acting honorably by protecting these assets from seizure, yet he had also recognized that the war's outcome had transformed their meaning and purpose. Mark was particularly struck by the last entry, dated December 1897, written when Samuel was an old man. Shortly after the windmill's completion, I have carried this burden for more than 30 years. I took an oath to protect these assets, and that oath did not expire with the Confederacy. But I have come to understand that they belong not to any government, past or present, but to history itself. They are artifacts of our nation's most grievous wound, and perhaps their true value lies in the lessons they might teach future generations about the terrible cost of division. I leave them here, beneath this windmill that gives life to my ranch, and I entrust to my descendants the wisdom to know when and how they should return to the light. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the excavation site, Mark and Dr. Chun carefully replaced the documents and resealed the chamber. They would need proper archival materials and better lighting to continue the documentation process. More urgently, they needed to prepare for tomorrow's confrontation with the FBI and other interested parties. What do you think happens now? Mark asked as they walked back toward the ranch house, the weight of his ancestors' words heavy in his thoughts. Dr. Chun considered the question carefully. Legally, this is uncharted territory. The government will certainly claim these assets based on their origin as Confederate property. But your family's continuous possession, combined with the clear documentation of Samuel's intentions, creates a compelling counter-argument. She continued, from a historical perspective, this is perhaps the most significant Civil War financial discovery in over a century. Museums will want it preserved intact. Collectors would pay astronomical sums for individual pieces. Academics will want access for research. And what about the Thornhill Ranch? Mark asked, voicing his most immediate concern. What about my family's future? Dr. Chin's expression softened. That's where you have leverage, Mr. Thornhill. This discovery happened on your land, preserved by your family for generations. Whatever legal claims might exist, you have both moral standing and practical control. No one can access this treasure without your cooperation. The evening brought a flurry of activity to the normally quiet ranch. Mark called a family meeting, sharing the full details of the discovery with Emily, Abigail, and his 20-year-old son Lucas, who was home from college for the summer. Their reactions ranged from incredulity to cautious excitement, but all understood the gravity of what had been uncovered. "Does this mean we can save the ranch?" Lucas asked, always the practical one. "It's not that simple," Mark explained. "This isn't just buried treasure we can cash in. It's historical artifacts with complex legal status. But yes, I believe it changes our situation fundamentally." Emily, who had been quietly processing everything, finally spoke. "Samuel preserved this treasure through the most difficult circumstances imaginable. He could have used it for himself, could have disappeared with a fortune. Instead, he protected it for future generations, for a purpose he couldn't fully envision." Her words resonated with Mark. Samuel hadn't just been following orders or protecting Confederate assets. He had been preserving history, creating a legacy that transcended the politics and conflicts of his time. Hector joined them later that evening, bringing the troubling news that word of the discovery had spread through the local community. "People are saying all kinds of things," he reported. "That you found Confederate gold, Union gold, Spanish doubloons, every version gets wilder. Santiago's cousin works at the diner in town, and she says it's all anyone's talking about." Mark wasn't surprised. In a small Texas community, news, especially extraordinary news, traveled at the speed of conversation. By morning, they could expect curiosity seekers and possibly even treasure hunters testing the boundaries of the property. "We need security," he decided. "Lucas, call your friends from the rodeo team. See who can come out tonight to help patrol the perimeter. We'll pay them what we can." It wasn't much, but the young cowboys who competed with Lucas were loyal and capable, and most owned rifles for hunting. By midnight, a makeshift security detail of 6 young men in pickup trucks was patrolling the ranch boundaries. Dr. Chun had departed with promises to return early the next morning, armed with legal resources and academic contacts who might help navigate the coming storm. Mark spent the night in his office, reviewing every document related to the ranch's history that he could find. Property deeds, family letters, photographs, anything that might strengthen their position in the inevitable negotiations ahead. Emily joined him after midnight, bringing coffee and her steady presence. "What would Samuel want us to do?" she asked, sitting across from him. "If he preserved this treasure for future generations, what purpose would he want it to serve now?" The question struck at the heart of Mark's dilemma. The gold represented immediate financial salvation for the struggling ranch if they could establish legal ownership. But Samuel's journal suggested he had seen beyond immediate needs to some greater historical purpose. "I think he would want us to honor both the past and the future," Mark said finally. "To respect the history this treasure represents, but also to ensure it serves the living as well as the dead." Morning brought the expected convoy of vehicles, more this time, and more official. Agent Foster returned with additional FBI personnel, accompanied by representatives from the Texas Historical Commission, the Smithsonian Institution, and what appeared to be Justice Department attorneys. Sheriff Caldwell arrived separately, positioning himself ambiguously between the government contingent and the Thornhill family. The meeting convened in the ranch's largest space, the converted barn that had once housed hay and equipment, but now served as an event venue for the occasional wedding or community gathering that brought supplemental income to the struggling operation. Mark had decided to control the narrative by presenting a united front. The entire Thornhill family was present, along with Dr. Chun, Hector, and the ranch's longtime attorney, James Whitaker, hastily summoned from San Antonio. Agent Foster opened the proceedings with the expected government position. "Based on preliminary information, we believe the artifacts discovered on this property constitute Confederate treasury assets that legally became U.S. government property. Following the Civil War, were prepared to secure the site and begin a formal excavation and recovery operation. One of the Justice Department attorneys elaborated on the legal framework, citing historical precedents and federal statutes regarding abandoned government property and cultural artifacts of national significance. His argument was polished and clearly prepared for this specific scenario, suggesting that the FBI had indeed been monitoring for such discoveries for decades. When they finished, Mark nodded to Attorney Whitaker, who rose with the confident demeanor of a man who had spent 40 years defending ranching families against corporate interests and government overreach. My client acknowledges the historical significance of this discovery, Whitaker began, but categorically rejects the government's claim of automatic ownership. The Thornhill family has maintained continuous possession of this property since 1868. The artifacts in question were deliberately placed in a secure chamber, constructed specifically for their preservation, not abandoned or discarded. He continued, holding up copies of the journal entries they had discovered. Furthermore, we have contemporaneous documentation indicating that Captain Samuel Thornhill, while initially acting under Confederate authority, made a conscious decision after the war to preserve these assets as historical artifacts rather than as government property. His intent, clearly stated, was to safeguard them for future generations, which he has successfully done through his descendants. The debate that followed was intense but surprisingly respectful. The Smithsonian representative, Dr. Howard Jenkins, seemed less concerned with ownership than with preservation. Whatever the legal resolution, he emphasized, these artifacts represent an unprecedented historical resource. They must be properly conserved, studied, and ultimately made accessible to scholars and the public. Dr. Chun supported this position, arguing that the historical significance transcended questions of legal ownership. This is perhaps the most complete and well-documented Confederate treasury collection in existence. Its value lies not just in the gold itself, but in the intact nature of the cash and the accompanying documentation. As the morning stretched into afternoon, the discussion evolved from confrontational to collaborative. Mark, listening more than speaking, began to see a path forward that might honor Samuel's intentions while securing his family's future. When he finally rose to address the gathering, the room fell silent. My great-great-grandfather preserved this treasure through the collapse of a government, a perilous journey across a broken nation, and the challenges of building a new life in frontier Texas. He could have used it for personal gain, but chose instead to protect it for a purpose he couldn't fully define. Mark gestured to his family, Emily, Lucas, and Abigail, who stood with him. 5 generations of Thornhills have been unwitting guardians of this history. Now that it's come to light, we intend to honor that responsibility. He outlined a scinde proposal that had formed in his mind during the long discussions. The Thornhill family would donate the majority of the artifacts to a new museum to be constructed on a portion of the ranch property. This museum, operated in partnership with the Smithsonian and the Texas Historical Commission, would preserve and display the Confederate treasury collection in its historical context, along with exhibits about the Civil War's economic dimensions and Samuel Thornhill's extraordinary journey. In exchange, the family would retain ownership of a small portion of the gold enough to secure the ranch's financial future and establish an endowment for the museum's ongoing operation. The Thornhill Ranch would continue as a working cattle operation, with portions open to visitors interested in experiencing authentic Texas ranching traditions, alongside the historical exhibits. Samuel preserved this treasure during one of our nation's darkest chapters, Mark concluded. He did so not to refight old battles, but to serve some future purpose he couldn't fully imagine. I believe this is that purpose, to transform what began as the wealth of a divided nation into a resource for education, preservation, and reconciliation. The silence that followed was broken by Dr. Jenkins from the Smithsonian. Speaking unofficially, he said, this proposal represents exactly the kind of public-private partnership our institution values. It preserves the historical context, provides public access, and respects the family's extraordinary role in this discovery. Even Agent Foster seemed receptive, though she emphasized that formal approvals would require extensive consultation with various government agencies. But I can say that your approach aligns with our primary concern, ensuring these artifacts are properly preserved and their historical significance respected. By day's end, a framework agreement had been drafted. The details would require months of negotiation, but the core principles were established: preservation, education, and a balanced recognition of both public and private interests in this extraordinary historical discovery. As the officials departed, promising to return with formal proposals, Mark stood with his family on the porch of the ranch house that had sheltered Thornhills for over a century. The setting sun cast golden light across the pastures where cattle still grazed, the barn where generations had worked, and the distant windmill site that had revealed its long-kept secret. "Do you think Samuel would approve?" Emily asked, slipping her hand into his. Mark nodded slowly. "I think he preserved this treasure not just from something, but for something. He couldn't know what challenges his descendants would face, or what purpose the gold might ultimately serve. But he trusted that when the time was right, it would emerge to fulfill its destiny." The Thornhill Ranch Museum of Civil War Finance opened 2 years later, a striking modern building rising from the Texas landscape near the original windmill site. Within its walls, visitors could see the Confederate treasury gold, displayed exactly as Samuel had arranged it, alongside his journal and interactive exhibits explaining the complex financial history of the Civil War and its aftermath. The ranch itself thrived, the cattle operation modernized with sustainable practices that honored both tradition and innovation. The medical bills that had once threatened their future were long since paid, and a foundation established in Samuel Thornhill's name provided scholarships for students studying history, agriculture, and ethics. Most evenings, Mark still found himself walking to the old windmill site, now carefully preserved with archaeological precision. Standing where his ancestor had once stood, he would watch the Texas sunset and reflect on the extraordinary chain of events that had connected them across time: a desperate Confederate officer, a struggling Texas rancher, linked by blood and by a shared understanding that true wealth lay not in gold itself, but in what it could build for future generations. The windmill that had once pumped water for thirsty cattle now drew people from across the country to learn, to reflect, and to understand how the past flows into the present. And in that transformation from practical function to something more profound, Mark saw the perfect metaphor for his family's journey and for the treasure that had waited so patiently to fulfill its purpose. The Thornhill legacy, like the gold itself, had been forged in difficult times, preserved through faith and determination, and ultimately revealed when it was needed most, not just as financial salvation, but as a bridge between past and future, connecting a family to its history and to possibilities its founder could only have imagined. 5 years had passed since the discovery beneath the old windmill foundation. The Thornhill Ranch Museum of Civil War Finance had evolved from a bold concept into a respected institution, drawing visitors from across the country to the once remote Texas property. What had begun as a desperate attempt to salvage scrap metal from a century-old structure had transformed not just the Thornhill family's fortunes, but their understanding of their place in American history. On a crisp October morning, Mark stood at the entrance of the museum's newest wing, a sleek, modern edition dedicated to divided currencies, the financial legacy of Civil War America. The grand opening ceremony was scheduled for noon, with representatives from the Smithsonian, the Federal Reserve Historical Society, and several prestigious universities expected to attend. "Everything's ready," Emily said, joining him with a clipboard containing the day's detailed schedule. Her health had improved dramatically in the years since the discovery, The stress of financial catastrophe replaced by purposeful work managing. The museum's educational programs. The lupus remained a chronic concern, but with proper treatment and reduced stress, she had reclaimed her energy and vitality. Mark nodded, taking in the exhibition space with pride. Glass cases displayed Confederate currency alongside Union banknotes, showing the parallel financial systems that had operated during the war. Interactive displays explained the complex economics of a nation torn in two, while personal artifacts, diaries, letters, ledgers humanized the abstract concepts of national finance and wartime economics. Samuel's journal is drawing the most interest from early visitors, Emily continued. The conservators say it's one of the most comprehensive first-person accounts of Confederate financial operations they've ever encountered. Mark smiled at this. His great-great-grandfather's meticulous documentation had proven invaluable not just for establishing the provenance of the gold, but for illuminating a little-understood aspect of Civil War history. Historians had long known about the evacuation of Confederate Treasury assets during Richmond's fall, but Samuel's journal provided unprecedented detail about the decision-making process, the transportation methods, and the human drama behind the financial maneuvers. "Dad," Abigail called, hurrying toward them with the confident stride of a young woman who had found her calling. Now 22 and completing her master's degree in museum studies, she had become the family's most passionate advocate for the educational mission of their unexpected enterprise. The school buses from Austin just arrived. 65th graders about to experience Civil War economics, Mark laughed. Think they'll appreciate the nuances of wartime monetary policy? Probably not, Abigail admitted. But we've got the interactive treasure hunt ready. They'll learn without realizing they're learning. As Abigail rushed off to greet the arriving students, Mark reflected on how the discovery had reshaped his children's futures. Abigail had abandoned her plans for veterinary school, finding unexpected passion in the intersection of history, education, and museum management. Lucas, now completing his business degree, had focused his studies on the management of family enterprises and historical tourism skills directly applicable to the evolving Thornhill legacy. Congressman Taylor just confirmed he's attending, Emily noted, checking her phone messages. That makes 3 representatives from the Texas delegation. The political interest in the museum had surprised Mark initially, but he had come to understand that the Thornhill discovery represented something beyond its historical significance. In a nation still wrestling with the legacy of the Civil War, their approach to the Confederate gold preserving its historical context while acknowledging its complicated moral status offered a template for handling other contested aspects of American history. "Mr. Thornhill?" a voice interrupted his thoughts. Mark turned to find a tall, distinguished man in his 60s approaching with an outstretched hand. "Walter Davidson, National Archives. I hope I'm not intruding before the official opening." Mark shook the offered hand, recognizing the name from correspondence about document preservation. "Not at all. We're just making final preparations. I wanted to personally thank you for your cooperation with our research team," Davidson said. "The documentation preserved alongside the gold has proven invaluable for our understanding of Confederate financial operations. This had been the most unexpected outcome of their discovery, the way Samuel's meticulous record-keeping had illuminated shadowy corners of American financial history. His journal and the accompanying documents had revealed previously unknown details about how the Confederacy had managed its gold reserves, attempted to establish international banking relationships, and planned for various contingencies as the war turned against them. "Samuel would be pleased to know his records are contributing to historical understanding," Mark replied. He seemed to understand he was preserving more than just gold. Davidson nodded thoughtfully. "That's actually why I wanted to speak with you. Our researchers have been cross-referencing Captain Thornhill's records with other Treasury documents from the period We believe this may not have been the only cache he was involved with. Mark felt a familiar surge of excitement, the same feeling he'd experienced when they first opened the hidden chamber. What do you mean? Captain Thornhill's JOURNAL mentions coordinating with other officers tasked with similar missions, Davidson explained. We've identified at least 3 other individuals who may have transported and secured portions of the Confederate treasury during the same period, if they followed similar protocols. The implication hung in the air between them. Other caches might still be waiting to be discovered, preserved in similar hidden chambers beneath ordinary structures across the South and West. I'd be happy to review any materials you found, Mark offered. Samuel's approach was quite distinctive. If others used similar methods, there might be recognizable patterns. As Davidson departed with promises to share the research, Mark found himself drawn once again to the central exhibit, the display that housed a portion of the original gold cache, arranged exactly as they had found it beneath the Windmill foundation. The gold bars and coins gleamed beneath museum-quality lighting, but it was the accompanying text that Mark considered most important, a careful explanation of the moral and historical complexity of Confederate wealth, acknowledging both the technological achievement of the coinage and the uncomfortable reality that much of the Confederacy's wealth derived from an economy built on human bondage. This unflinching honesty had initially concerned some of the museum's advisors, who worried it might alienate visitors with strong feelings about Civil War history. Instead, it had become one of the institution's most praised aspects, its willingness to present historical artifacts in their full context, neither glorifying nor condemning but inviting visitors to engage with the complexities of the American past. "There you are," said a familiar voice as Hector approached, dressed uncharacteristically in a suit and tie for the opening ceremony. The former ranch foreman had transitioned to facilities director for both the museum and the working portions of the ranch, his practical knowledge proving invaluable as they balanced historical preservation with agricultural operations. "Just doing a final walkthrough," Mark explained. "Everything ready on your end?" Hector nodded. "Parking areas are marked, security team is in position, and we've got the demonstration area set up for the traditional ranching exhibits." He paused, a hint of their old friendship breaking through the professional relationship. "Did you ever imagine this is where tearing down that old windmill would lead?" Mark shook his head, remembering the desperation of that day 5 years ago, the crushing debt, Emily's medical bills, the imminent foreclosure. "I was just hoping for enough scrap metal to buy another week's feed for the cattle. And now look at us." Hector gestured toward the expansive museum campus that had grown alongside the traditional ranch buildings, hosting congressmen and Smithsonian directors. The transformation had been extraordinary by any measure. The initial agreement with the government had allowed the Thornhills to retain ownership of enough gold to secure the ranch's financial future, while the majority of the artifacts were preserved for public benefit through the museum. The arrangement had evolved into a unique public-private partnership, with the Thornhill family maintaining control of the ranch and museum operations while collaborating with national institutions on research and educational programming. The working ranch continued, now showcasing sustainable cattle ranching practices alongside its historical exhibits. The herd had been rebuilt with premium stock, and the Thornhill brand had been repositioned as a heritage beef producer, commanding premium prices from restaurants and retailers eager to associate with the ranch's storied name. Most importantly, the discovery had allowed them to establish the Samuel Thornhill Foundation, which provided scholarships for students studying American history, sustainable agriculture, and museum management. The foundation also funded research into other potential Confederate treasury caches, working with property owners across the South to investigate historical structures using non-invasive archaeological techniques. As noon approached, visitors began gathering for the opening ceremony. Mark watched with pride as Lucas, home from graduate school for the event, confidently directed the setup of the outdoor presentation area. His son had inherited Samuel's meticulous attention to detail, combined with a modern understanding of experience design and visitor engagement. "Mr. Thornhill?" A museum staff member approached. "The governor's motorcade just arrived. Dr. Chun is greeting him, but she suggested you might want to join them." Mark nodded and made his way to the main entrance, where Dr. Elizabeth Chun, now the museum's academic director, was welcoming the Texas governor and his entourage. Their relationship had evolved from cautious consultant and client to genuine friendship and professional collaboration, with Dr. Chen overseeing the academic integrity of the museum's exhibits and publications. "Mark," she called, waving him. "Over. I was just telling the governor about our latest research project." The latest project had become Dr. Chun's passion, a comprehensive study of how Confederate assets had been dispersed, hidden, and ultimately integrated into the post-war economy. Using Samuel's records as a starting point, her team had traced financial flows that revealed unexpected connections between former Confederate officers, Western development projects, and the emergence of Texas as an economic powerhouse in the late 19th century. "It's remarkable what you've built here," the governor said, shaking Mark's hand. "Not just preserving history, but making it relevant to contemporary audiences." As they walked toward the ceremony area, Mark reflected on this unexpected outcome of their discovery. When they had first found the gold, his primary concern had been saving the ranch, preserving his family's legacy in the most immediate, practical sense. He couldn't have imagined how that definition of legacy would expand and deepen over the years that followed. The ceremony itself unfolded with the polished efficiency that had become the museum's hallmark. Speeches acknowledged the unique collaboration between the Thornhill family, government institutions, and academic partners. A ribbon cutting officially opened the new wing, with Abigail proudly leading the first group of visitors, the fifth graders, from Austin on their inaugural tour. As the formal program concluded and guests dispersed to explore the exhibits, Mark found himself drawn back to a small, easily overlooked display near the museum's entrance. Unlike the spectacular gold exhibits or the interactive technology stations, this simple glass case contained only a few personal items: Samuel Thornhill's pocket watch, his cavalry spurs, and the simple fountain pen he had used to record his extraordinary journey in the journal that had validated their claims to the treasure. These humble objects spoke to Mark more powerfully than the gleaming gold bars. They represented a man who had lived through a nation's most traumatic division, who had carried an enormous responsibility through dangerous and uncertain times, and who had made choices that reverberated across generations, choices that had ultimately saved his great-great-grandson's legacy over 150 years later. "I thought I might find you here," Emily said softly, joining him at the display case. "You always end up back at Samuel's personal effects." Mark smiled, acknowledging the truth in her observation. "I keep wondering what he would think of all this. A museum built around his secret mission. Thousands of people learning about the financial history of the Civil War because of what he preserved. I think he'd be proud," Emily said. "Not just of the museum, but of how we've handled his legacy. He wasn't preserving that gold for personal gain. He could have used it himself if that was his goal. He was preserving it for something larger, something he couldn't fully envision but trusted would eventually emerge." This had become Mark's conviction as well, that Samuel had acted not just as a Confederate officer following orders, but as a guardian of history, somehow understanding that the artifacts he protected would someday serve a purpose beyond the immediate conflicts of his era. The journal entries supported this interpretation, showing how Samuel's thinking had evolved from protecting Confederate assets to preserving historical artifacts that belonged to future generations of Americans, regardless of sectional divisions. "Dad," Lucas called, approaching with barely contained excitement, "you need to come see this." Walter Davidson from the National Archives wants to show you something. Mark followed his son to a quiet corner of the reception area, where Davidson was waiting with a leather portfolio and an expression of controlled enthusiasm. "Mr. Thornhill, after our conversation earlier, I made some calls to my research team in Washington," Davidson explained. "They've been analyzing Samuel's references to his fellow officers and cross-referencing them with other records from the period." He opened the portfolio to reveal a map of the southern and western states, with several locations marked in red. "These are properties currently owned by descendants of officers mentioned in Samuel's journal," Davidson continued. "Officers who, like him, were entrusted with portions of the Confederate treasury during the evacuation of Richmond." Mark studied the map, noting locations in western Virginia, Tennessee, Texas, and even California. "You think there might be similar caches at these locations?" Davidson nodded. "The pattern is remarkably consistent. These officers all survived the war, all established properties in relatively remote areas, all constructed substantial permanent structures between 1865 and 1900, and all maintained family ownership of those properties through subsequent generations." The implications were extraordinary. If Samuel's cache was just one of several, strategically distributed across the country, the potential historical significance extended far beyond what they had already discovered. It suggested a level of planning and foresight among Confederate Treasury officials that historians had never fully appreciated. Contingency strategy for preserving financial assets regardless of the war's outcome. "We're proposing a collaborative research initiative," Davidson continued. "Working with the current property owners, using non-invasive archaeological techniques to investigate these sites, with any discoveries handled through the same kind of partnership model you've established here." Mark felt a surge of purpose that transcended the day's celebrations. This wasn't just about the Thornhill legacy anymore. It was about illuminating a hidden chapter of American history, connecting families across the country who might be unwitting guardians of similar historical treasures. The Samuel Thornhill Foundation would be honored to support this research, Mark said, already envisioning the possibilities. "Our experience could help these families navigate the complex legal and historical considerations if discoveries are made." As Davidson outlined the proposed research methodology, Mark found himself thinking once again about his ancestors' extraordinary foresight. Samuel couldn't have known exactly how his actions would impact future generations, but he had somehow understood that the artifacts he preserved would someday serve a greater purpose than he could imagine in the chaotic aftermath of Civil War. Later that evening, as the final visitors departed and staff began closing procedures, Mark made his way to the Windmill site, now preserved as an archaeological feature, with a viewing platform allowing visitors to see where the discovery had occurred. In the gathering twilight, with the museum buildings illuminated behind him, he contemplated the chain of events that had connected him to Samuel across the span of 150 years. A desperate Confederate officer protecting Treasury assets through the collapse of his government. A desperate Texas rancher demolishing an old structure to salvage its material value. Two men separated by time, but united by blood and by the land they had fought to preserve, each making decisions that would ripple far beyond their immediate circumstances. The old windmill had once drawn water from deep beneath the Texas soil, sustaining generations of Thornhill cattle. Its destruction had revealed a different kind of sustenance, not just the gold that had saved the ranch financially, but the history that had given the family a deeper understanding of their place in the American story. As darkness settled over the ranch, the stars emerging in the vast Texas sky, Mark thought about what they had really discovered beneath that weathered foundation. Not just Confederate gold, but a bridge across time, a connection between past and present that reminded him that no generation acts alone. Each leaves behind resources, knowledge, and values that shape the options available to those who follow. Samuel Thornhill had preserved more than gold. He had preserved possibility, the opportunity for his descendants to make choices he couldn't have imagined, to build something he couldn't have envisioned, but that somehow honored the principles of preservation, responsibility, and stewardship that had guided his own actions in uncertain times. The Thornhill Ranch continued its centuries-old purpose, raising cattle on the rolling Texas grasslands. But it had added new dimensions to that legacy: education, historical preservation, scholarship, and community engagement. The old and new stood side by side, neither diminishing the other but creating something richer than either could be alone. Mark took one last look at the preserved windmill site before turning toward the ranch house where his family waited. The foundation that had hidden Samuel's secret for over a century now stood open to the world, its purpose fulfilled in ways its creator could never have fully imagined, but would surely have approved. The journey that had begun with a desperate demolition had led to construction of a museum, of educational programs, of a sustainable future for the ranch, and of a deeper understanding of how past and present continually shape each other. The windmill was gone, but the legacy it had protected continued to turn, drawing not water but wisdom from the depths of American history, sustaining not just one family, but all who came to learn from what a Confederate officer had preserved, and a struggling rancher had discovered beneath the Texas soil. As Mark walked back toward the lights of home, he carried with him the certainty that Samuel had understood something essential, that true legacy isn't measured in gold or land or buildings, but in the values, knowledge, and possibilities we preserve for generations we will never meet, trusting them to find purpose in what we leave behind when they need it most. 10 years after the discovery beneath the windmill foundation, the Thornhill Legacy Project had expanded far beyond Mark's initial vision. What had begun as a desperate act of demolition on a failing ranch had rippled outward, touching lives and institutions across the nation. On a brilliant spring morning, Mark stood at the window of his office in the museum's administrative wing, watching visitors stream toward the newly completed National Center for Civil War Financial History, collaboration between the Thornhill Foundation, the Smithsonian Institution, and the Federal Reserve. The gleaming modern structure, with its soaring glass atrium and careful integration into the Texas landscape, represented the culmination of a decade of research, preservation, and educational development. It housed not only the original Thornhill discovery, but artifacts from 7 additional caches, located through the collaborative research initiative Mark had helped establish with Walter Davidson and the National Archives. "The Secretary of the Treasury just arrived," Emily said, entering with the composed efficiency that had made her the museum's most effective director during its formative years. Though she had officially stepped back from day-to-day operations to focus on educational programming, major events still benefited from her organizational skills. Abigail's greeting him now. Mark nodded, adjusting his tie. At 52, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had faced financial ruin and emerged not just solvent, but purposeful. The lines around his eyes had deepened. His hair had acquired distinguished touches of silver, but his posture remained that of a working rancher, straight-backed and grounded. "Never imagined we'd be hosting cabinet secretaries when I was trying to salvage scrap metal from that old windmill," he remarked, a hint of wonder still coloring his voice even after a decade of extraordinary developments. Emily squeezed his hand. Samuel would be proud, not just of the museum, but of how the discovery has changed our understanding of that era. The historical implications of the multiple Confederate treasury caches had indeed transformed academic understanding of the Civil War's financial dimensions. What historians had once viewed as haphazard evacuation efforts during Richmond's fall now appeared as a sophisticated contingency plan, a network of trusted officers tasked with preserving portions of the Confederate financial system against various potential outcomes. More surprising had been the documentation found alongside the gold in several caches records, revealing that by late 1864, Certain Confederate Treasury officials had begun planning not for military victory, but for the preservation of Southern economic interests in a post-war nation. These officials, operating without direct oversight from political leadership, had created a distributed financial reserve that could potentially support regional recovery regardless of political developments. "Lucas just texted," Emily said, checking her phone. "The governor's motorcade is 5 minutes out. He's bringing the congressional delegation with him." Mark took a deep breath, preparing for the day's ceremonies. The dedication of the new research center represented more than just an expansion of the Thornhill Museum. It marked the formal establishment of a national resource for understanding a previously obscured aspect of American history. As they made their way to the reception area, Mark reflected on how their family story had become interwoven with a larger national narrative. The Thornhill discovery had spawned doctoral dissertations, academic conferences, television documentaries, and a best-selling book co-authored by Dr. Chen and Mark himself, titled "Gold in the Foundation: The Hidden Financial History of the Civil War." But perhaps most meaningful had been the connections formed with other families whose ancestors had played similar roles to Samuel Thornhill. The Davidson Research Initiative, named for the National Archives historian who had first identified the pattern, had located descendants of 7 other Confederate officers who had transported and secured portions of the treasury during Richmond's evacuation. In Tennessee, the Wilkerson family had discovered a cache beneath their ancestral barn. In Western Virginia, the Hendersons had found Confederate gold hidden in a chamber beneath their family cemetery. A California winery owned by the descendants of a former Confederate naval officer had yielded treasury documents and gold coins concealed within the original wine cellar's foundation. Each discovery had followed a similar pattern: careful concealment in structures built between 1865 and 1900, preservation across multiple generations of family ownership, and rediscovery during renovation or financial crisis. Together, they formed a complex mosaic of post-Civil War financial history that researchers were still piecing together. The reception area hummed with anticipation as distinguished guests arrived for the dedication ceremony. Academics in formal attire mingled with government officials, museum professionals, and representatives from the families whose discoveries had contributed to the center's collections. Mark moved through the crowd, greeting visitors with the easy charm of a man comfortable in dual roles, both working rancher and custodian of history. "Mr. Thornhill," called a voice from across the room. Mark turned to see Eleanor Wilkerson approaching with her teenage grandson in tow. The Tennessee matriarch had become a close friend since the discovery of the Wilkerson cache 5 years earlier. Benjamin wanted to see the comparative display before the crowds arrive. Mark smiled at the young man, who clutched a research notebook with scholarly intensity. At 16, Benjamin Wilkerson had already published a peer-reviewed article analyzing the metallurgical differences between Confederate gold minted in New Orleans versus Richmond research, made possible by access to samples from multiple caches. "The curator's doing final checks now," Mark told them. "I'll see if we can get you in for a preview." This was the aspect of the project that gave Mark the most satisfaction, watching young people engage with history not as a static set of facts but as an ongoing investigation, a puzzle with pieces still being discovered and connections still being made. The Thornhill Foundation Scholarship Program had already supported dozens of students, pursuing research related to Civil War finance, Southern economic recovery, and the evolution of the American banking system. As Mark arranged for Benjamin's early access to the exhibit, he caught sight of his own grandson, 4-year-old Samuel, named for his great-grandfather playing beneath a table in the children's education area. The boy was arranging replica gold coins in careful patterns, his small face set in concentration. The sight brought a lump to Mark's throat. 6 generations of Thornhills now connected to this land, to this legacy that had nearly been lost before its true dimensions were understood. Lucas and his wife Caroline had built their home on the ranch property, ensuring that young Samuel would grow up immersed in both the working, agricultural operation and the historical enterprise it had spawned. "Everyone's in position," Abigail announced, appearing at Mark's side with the brisk efficiency that had made her the museum's associate director at just 32. Her academic credentials, a Ph.D. in public history from the University of Texas, were complemented by practical experience managing the rapidly expanding institution. "We should head to the platform." The dedication ceremony took place in the center's soaring atrium, where 7 glass pillars, each containing artifacts from one of the discovered caches, surrounded a central display housing the original Thornhill find. The architectural symbolism was deliberate, presenting the discoveries as connected parts of a single historical narrative rather than isolated treasures. As Mark took his place among the dignitaries on the platform, he surveyed the gathering with quiet pride. Representatives from each of the 7 families sat in the front row, a living connection to the Confederate officers who had carried out their secret missions across a divided nation. Behind them, academics whose research had been transformed by these discoveries sat alongside government officials whose agencies had helped preserve and contextualize the artifacts. The Secretary of the Treasury spoke first, acknowledging the unique collaboration between private families, academic institutions, and government agencies that had made the center possible. "What began as a single family's discovery has evolved into a national resource for understanding our complex financial history," he noted. "The Thornhill model of preservation with purpose has become a template for how we approach similar historical finds." The governor followed, emphasizing the economic impact of historical tourism on the region and the educational benefits for Texas students. Representatives from the Smithsonian and the Federal Reserve highlighted the research potential of having multiple Confederate treasury caches available for comparative study in a single location. When Mark's turn came to speak, he approached the podium with the straightforward dignity that had characterized his stewardship of the discovery from the beginning. 10 years ago, he began, our family faced the potential loss of a ranch that had sustained Thornhills for 5 generations. In a last desperate attempt to generate income, we began demolishing an old windmill that had stood on our property for over a century. He paused, letting the improbability of what followed hang in the air for a moment. What we discovered beneath that foundation transformed our understanding not just of our family's history, but of a critical chapter in American financial development. My great-great-grandfather Samuel Thornhill had preserved not just gold, but knowledge documentation that illuminated decisions made during one of our nation's most challenging transitions. Mark gestured toward the families seated in the front row. We now know that Samuel wasn't acting alone. He was part of a network of officers entrusted with preserving portions of the Confederate financial system during Richmond's fall. Their actions, carried out amid the chaos of a collapsing government, reflected remarkable foresight, not about continuing the conflict, but about ensuring economic recovery for future generations. He continued, describing how the coordinated preservation of these financial assets represented a sophisticated contingency plan that transcended the military outcome of the war. The officers had been selected not just for their loyalty, but for their connections to regions where post-war recovery would be possible regardless of political developments. What these men preserved wasn't simply Confederate wealth, Mark emphasized. It was the possibility of economic rebuilding in a reunified nation. Their documentation shows that by 1864, certain Treasury officials had begun planning not for continued separation, but for Southern participation in a reconstructed financial system. This had been the most surprising revelation from the comparative study of the cache's evidence that some Confederate officials had privately acknowledged the likelihood of defeat and had begun preparing for economic integration rather than continued resistance. The gold had been preserved not as a war chest for future conflict, but as capital for post-war development. Today, we dedicate this center not just to preserving artifacts, but to continuing the work of understanding. Each discovery has raised new questions about the financial dimensions of the Civil War and its aftermath. Each family's story has added texture to our understanding of how individuals navigated the collapse of one economic system and the emergence of another. As Mark concluded his remarks, he felt a profound sense of completion, not of the historical work, which would continue for generations, but of the journey that had begun with that desperate demolition project. The Thornhill Ranch had been saved, but it had also been transformed into something Samuel could never have imagined, yet would surely have approved a place where past and present engaged in continuous dialogue. The ceremony concluded with the official opening of the Research Center's main exhibition hall, where visitors could explore the financial history of the Civil War through artifacts, documents, and interactive displays. The central feature, a life-sized recreation of Samuel Thornhill's journey from Richmond to Texas, allowed visitors to follow his route through a landscape transformed by war, experiencing the decisions and challenges he had faced at each stage. As the formal program transitioned to a reception, Mark found himself standing beside the original Windmill foundation, now preserved under climate-controlled glass as the literal and symbolic starting point of the center's historical narrative. Dr. Elizabeth Chen joined him there, her academic precision balanced by genuine affection for the family whose discovery had transformed her career. "I've been thinking about contingency," she said, studying the foundation with its revealed chamber. "How Samuel and his colleagues created a distributed system to protect against multiple possible futures. They couldn't know exactly what was coming, but they prepared for various scenarios." Mark nodded, understanding the parallel she was drawing. Like demolishing a windmill to salvage scrap metal and discovering something that changes everything. Samuel couldn't have known exactly how or when his cash would be found, but he preserved it for whatever future might need it. Exactly. Dr. Chun agreed. These men were operating at the intersection of collapse and possibility. They preserved resources that could serve different purposes depending on how history unfolded. This perspective had become central to the educational approach of the Thornhill Museum and the new Research Center, emphasizing how individuals throughout history had made decisions with incomplete information, preparing for futures they could only partially envision. It was a framework that resonated with contemporary visitors facing their own uncertainties about climate change, technological disruption, and political division. As the reception continued, Mark made his way to where Emily was speaking with Lucas and Carolyn, young Samuel now asleep in his father's arms, despite the surrounding activity. The sight of 4 generations of Thornhills gathered beside displays, explaining Samuel's journey, created a visual connection across time that moved Mark deeply. "He's completely worn out," Carolyn said, nodding toward her sleeping son. He insisted on explaining the difference between Confederate and Union gold coins to anyone who would listen. Mark laughed softly. "Samuel starting young with the family business, I see." The family business had indeed evolved in ways no one could have predicted. The working ranch continued, now managed primarily by Lucas with sustainable practices that honored both tradition and innovation. The Museum and Research Center, guided by Abigail's academic expertise, had developed into a nationally recognized educational institution. And the Thornhill Foundation, chaired by Emily, supported research and preservation efforts extending far beyond their own discovery. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save a struggling ranch had blossomed into an enterprise that sustained the family financially while connecting them to a broader historical purpose. The gold that had remained hidden for over a century had emerged at precisely the moment when it could serve not just one family's needs but a national conversation about how we understand our financial past. As evening approached and the guests gradually departed, Mark found himself drawn once again to the windmill site, now an archaeological exhibit with interpretive signage explaining its significance. The Texas sunset painted the landscape in gold and amber, a fitting backdrop for reflection on what they had discovered and what they had built. Samuel Thornhill had carried Confederate gold across a shattered nation, preserving it through the chaos of defeat and the challenges of reconstruction. He had hidden it beneath a structure built to sustain life on the frontier, trusting that future generations would find it when the time was right. And they had at the precise moment when the Thornhill legacy stood on the brink of being lost. When the ranch that had sustained 5 generations faced foreclosure and dissolution. But the true legacy hadn't been the gold itself. It had been Samuel's foresight in recognizing that resources preserved during one era might serve unforeseen purposes in another, that actions taken amid collapse could create possibilities for renewal generations later. He couldn't have known exactly how his cache would be discovered or what purpose it would ultimately serve, but he had trusted the future to find meaning in what he preserved. Standing in the glow of the setting sun, Mark realized that their decade-long journey had taught him something profound about the nature of legacy itself. It wasn't simply about passing wealth or property from one generation to the next. It was about preserving possibilities, creating resources, knowledge, and values that future generations could draw upon to meet challenges that the present couldn't fully anticipate. The Thornhill Ranch continued its centuries-old work, raising cattle on the rolling Texas grasslands. The Museum and Research Center welcomed visitors from around the world, illuminating a previously obscured chapter of American financial history. And young Samuel, named for the man whose actions had made it all possible, was growing up immersed in both worlds, the practical realities of ranching and the intellectual excitement of historical discovery. The windmill that had once drawn water from deep beneath the Texas soil was gone, but the foundation that had hidden Samuel's secret for over a century now stood revealed. A testament to one man's foresight and another's desperate gamble. Together, they had created something neither could have fully imagined, but that honored the legacy of both. A place where past and future, practical and intellectual, personal and national came together in dynamic conversation. As darkness settled over the land, Mark turned toward the lights of the ranch house where his family waited. The path forward was illuminated not just by electric lights, but by the knowledge that each generation builds upon the foundations laid by those who came before, sometimes discovering treasures hidden within those foundations that transform understanding of both past and future. The old windmill had served its purpose, drawing life-sustaining water from the depths. Its demolition, seemingly an act of desperation, had revealed a different kind of sustenance connecting the Thornhill family not just to their own history, but to a national narrative about resilience, foresight, and the complex interweaving of personal and public legacy. As Mark walked toward home, he carried with him the certainty that Samuel had understood something essential about legacy, that it isn't measured primarily in gold or land or buildings, but in the possibilities we preserve for generations we will never meet, trusting them to find purpose in what we leave behind when they need it most. The true treasure hadn't been Confederate gold, hidden for over a century beneath a Texas windmill. It had been the vision to preserve resources during collapse, the determination to search for solutions amid crisis, and the wisdom to recognize that what sustains us through difficult times may come from sources we never expected, preserved by ancestors who somehow trusted the future to make meaning from what they left behind. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.